Frank's heart nearly stopped as he spotted something gleaming beneath the twisted metal and debris. Nestled in a shallow depression under his tornado-ravaged barn in rural Montana lay a cluster of eggs unlike anything he'd ever seen, each one as black as midnight, with shells that seemed to absorb the very sunlight touching them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The eggs were perfectly arranged, about the size of chicken eggs but with an otherworldly metallic sheen to their surface. Even more strange, they were warm to the touch despite being exposed to the cool mountain air. In his 40 years of farming, Frank had never encountered anything like this. His first instinct was to call the local wildlife authority, but something made him hesitate. In these difficult times, with his farm struggling to stay afloat after 3 consecutive years of drought, he couldn't shake the feeling that these mysterious eggs might be more than just an odd discovery. They could be the miracle his family desperately needed. The Dawson family farm had been a cornerstone of Whispering Pines Valley for over a century. Frank had inherited it from his father, who had received it from his father before him. The sprawling property, with its rolling hills and fertile soil, had once been the pride of Montana's egg production industry. Local stores would compete for the chance to stock Dawson's premium eggs, known throughout the state for their quality and freshness. Even the prestigious restaurants in Helena and Missoula would specifically request their eggs, praising their rich, golden yolks and exceptional taste. But times had changed dramatically in recent years. The rise of industrial farming operations had pushed prices down to levels that small family farms could barely compete with. The severe drought that had plagued the region had driven feed costs through the roof, forcing Frank to sell off portions of his flock just to keep the lights on. His wife Sarah had even taken a job in town to help make ends meet, something that had never been necessary in the farm's long history. The final blow had come last week when the tornado ripped through their property, destroying the main barn and damaging crucial equipment. The savage wind had torn through their land like an angry giant, scattering decades of hard work across the valley. Their insurance would cover some of the losses, but Frank knew it wouldn't be enough. The adjuster's pitying look had said it all. They'd be lucky to get half of what they needed to rebuild. Just yesterday, their youngest daughter Emma had found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and paperwork, trying to hide the tears in his eyes as he calculated how many months they had left before they might lose everything. The sight of his 12-year-old's worried face had nearly broken him. Emma had always dreamed of being the 4th generation to run the farm, but now that dream seemed as shattered as their old barn. Their older son Michael had already left for college on a scholarship, studying agricultural science with hopes of bringing modern techniques back to the farm. Frank hadn't had the heart to tell him during their weekly calls just how dire the situation had become. Every Sunday evening, he'd forced cheerfulness into his voice as he assured Michael everything was just fine back home. Now, staring at these mysterious black eggs, Frank felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. He'd heard stories of rare chicken breeds that could command premium prices from collectors and specialty markets, but these eggs, they were something else entirely. The way they seemed to shine with an inner light, their perfectly smooth shells unmarked by any blemish. It was almost as if they weren't from this world at all. Frank gently ran his weathered hand over one of the eggs, marveling at how the surface felt both cool and warm at the same time. He counted 12 in total, arranged in a perfect circle. There were no tracks or signs around them to indicate what kind of creature might have laid them. The recent storm had wiped away any traces that might have existed, leaving only these enigmatic objects behind like a gift from the heavens themselves. As he knelt there considering his options, a warm breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of rain and renewal. In that moment, Frank made his decision. He carefully gathered the eggs, cradling them in his worn canvas jacket, the same jacket his father had worn when teaching him how to tend to their first flock of chickens. If there was even a chance these could help save his family's legacy, he had to try. He'd raise whatever emerged from these eggs himself, giving them the same care and attention he'd given to every animal that had ever lived on his farm. Walking back to the house, Frank's mind raced with possibilities. He still had the old incubator in the storage shed, the one his father had used to start their first flock of heritage breed chickens. It would need some cleaning up, but it should still work. The ancient machine had been gathering dust since their operation had expanded years ago, but Frank remembered how reliable it had been. His father always said that old equipment had soul. Unlike the modern plastic things that broke after a season or two. He'd have to keep this quiet, though, at least until he knew what he was dealing with. The last thing he needed was curious neighbors or wildlife officials asking questions he couldn't answer. In a small community like theirs, news traveled faster than summer lightning, and Frank couldn't risk someone trying to claim his discovery before he had a chance to understand what he'd found. As he approached his farmhouse, its white paint peeling and weather-worn, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Whatever these eggs might contain, they represented a chance, perhaps his last chance, to turn things around. He just prayed that his decision to keep them wouldn't turn out to be the biggest mistake of his life. The weight of the eggs in his jacket pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if carrying the entire future of the Dawson family farm within their mysterious black shells. The Dawson farm hadn't always been on the brink of collapse. Frank remembered the golden days, just a decade ago, when their egg production business had been thriving. Every morning, he'd wake before dawn to the sound of thousands of healthy chickens, their combined clucking a symphony that had been the soundtrack to his entire life. The massive operation they'd built had been the result of 3 generations of hard work, innovation, and dedication. Frank's grandfather, Thomas Dawson, had started with just 50 chickens in 1923, selling eggs door-to-door in Whispering Pines Valley. He'd built the farm's reputation on honesty and quality, often telling customers, "If you find a bad egg, I'll replace the whole dozen and throw in another for good measure." That promise had never cost him much. The Dawsons had always taken pride in their attention to detail. His father, James Dawson, had expanded the operation in the 1960s, introducing new breeds and modern techniques while maintaining the family's commitment to quality. He'd been the first farmer in the county to install automated feeding systems, and his innovative approach to farm management had earned him features in several agricultural magazines. "The future belongs to those who plan for it," he'd always said, words that now haunted Frank as he faced the farm's uncertain future. Under Frank's management, the farm had reached its peak in 2013, with over 50,000 laying hens producing some of the finest eggs in the state. They'd had contracts with major supermarket chains, high-end restaurants, and even a few organic food distributors. The Dawson name had become synonymous with excellence in the industry, and their premium organic line had won awards at state fairs 3 years running. But the decline had started subtly. First came the rise of mega farms 2 states over, their massive operations allowing them to undercut prices in ways small family farms couldn't match. Frank had tried to compete by emphasizing quality over quantity, but profit margins grew thinner with each passing year. Then came the feed price increases, driven by unpredictable weather patterns that had devastated grain crops across the region. Sarah, his wife of 25 years, had stood by him through it all. She'd supported every decision, even when he'd taken out a second mortgage to upgrade their equipment in an attempt to increase efficiency. A former school teacher, she'd eventually returned to substitute teaching at the local elementary school to help make ends meet. Every morning, she'd leave before sunrise, her lunch packed in the same blue container she'd used for decades, trying to hide her worry behind a brave smile. Their children had felt the change too. Michael, their firstborn, had won a scholarship to study agricultural science at Montana State University. Though he'd dreamed of returning to modernize the family farm, Frank suspected his son now saw more opportunity in corporate agriculture consulting. The thought of being the generation that lost the farm weighed heavily on Frank's conscience. Emma, their youngest, still held on to the dream of becoming a farmer. At 12, she spent every moment she could helping with the chickens, giving each one a name and treating them like pets. She'd even started a small egg-selling business of her own, with 20 heritage breed chickens she'd raised from chicks. Her enthusiasm reminded Frank of himself at that age, making the current situation even more painful. Last month's bank statement had been the clearest sign yet of their dire situation. Their operating costs had exceeded income by such a margin that Frank had had to dip into their rapidly dwindling savings just to pay the farmhands. He'd already had to let go of 3 longtime employees, people who'd been more like family than workers. Old Joe Peterson, who'd worked the feed mill for 20 years, had understood completely, but that hadn't made it any easier. The tornado that had torn through their property last week had seemed like the final nail in the coffin. It had destroyed their main barn, damaged crucial equipment, and scattered debris across their best grazing fields. The insurance adjuster's visit had confirmed Frank's worst fears. The payout would cover barely half the cost of rebuilding. The man had tried to be kind, but his words had cut deep. "Maybe it's time to consider other options, Mr. Dawson." Frank had spent the entire previous night at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to find some way to make the numbers work. The pile of bills seemed to mock him. Feed suppliers demanding payment, utility companies threatening to cut service, equipment loans coming due. The bank had already denied their request for another loan extension. According to his calculations, they had maybe 3 months before they'd be forced to sell. Standing now in the aftermath of the storm, staring at these mysterious black eggs, Frank felt a strange stirring of the hope he'd thought was dead. Could these unusual eggs be the miracle they needed? He'd heard stories of rare breeds selling for thousands of dollars, of specialty markets paying premium prices for exotic poultry. But something about these eggs seemed different, special in a way he couldn't quite explain. The rational part of his mind warned him about getting his hopes up. After all, they could be snake eggs or something even worse. But decades of farming had given him an instinct about these things, and something told him these eggs were exactly what they needed. He just had to figure out what they were and how to hatch them properly. As he carefully gathered the eggs in his jacket, Frank made a silent promise to his family, to the generations of Dawsons who had built this farm, and to himself. Whatever emerged from these eggs, he would do everything in his power to make it count. The future of their farm might just depend on it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the debris-strewn farmyard as Frank carefully examined his mysterious discovery. He'd found a sturdy wooden crate among the wreckage and lined it with soft hay, creating a temporary nest for the 12 black eggs. Now, kneeling beside them, he could study their peculiar characteristics more closely. Each egg was slightly larger than a standard chicken egg, about the size of his palm, and possessed a perfect oval shape that seemed almost artificial in its symmetry. The shells weren't just black. They exhibited an unusual iridescence that shifted colors when viewed from different angles. In direct sunlight, hints of deep purple and midnight blue rippled across their surfaces like oil on water. When shadows fell across them, they seemed to absorb the darkness, becoming even blacker than before. Frank ran his calloused fingers gently over one egg's surface, marveling at its texture. Unlike normal eggshells, which had visible pores and slight imperfections, these were impossibly smooth, almost like polished stone. Yet they maintained a warmth that defied explanation, as if harboring some internal energy source. When he held one up to his ear, he could have sworn he heard a faint, rhythmic pulsing like a tiny heartbeat. "What in God's name are you?" he whispered, turning the egg carefully in his hands. In all his years of farming, he'd seen eggs from every domestic breed imaginable, and even some multic bird species, but nothing came close to these. He'd once attended a rare poultry exhibition in Bozeman, where exotic breed eggs had been displayed, including the prized black-shelled eggs of the ayam cemani chicken from Indonesia. But even those hadn't possessed this otherworldly quality. The location of their discovery added to the mystery. The eggs had been arranged in a perfect circle beneath the collapsed barn, nestled in a shallow depression that seemed deliberately carved into the earth. There were no signs of a nest, no scattered feathers or other materials that might indicate what had laid them. The tornado had obliterated any tracks or other evidence, leaving only these enigmatic objects behind. As Frank continued his examination, his mind wandered to the old stories his grandfather used to tell, tales of mysterious creatures in the mountains, of lights in the sky over Whispering Pines Valley, of strange occurrences that defied explanation. He'd always dismissed them as tall tales meant to entertain children, but now, holding these impossible eggs, He wondered if there might have been some truth to those stories after all. A sudden gust of wind scattered some loose hay, making Frank instinctively shield the eggs. The protective gesture surprised him. He'd already grown oddly attached to these mysterious objects. Perhaps it was desperation, or maybe some farmer's instinct, but something told him these eggs were special. They represented more than just a scientific curiosity. They might be the miracle his family needed. Frank reached for his phone, thinking to photograph the eggs, but hesitated. In today's connected world, unusual discoveries had a way of drawing unwanted attention. One viral photo could bring curious onlookers, wildlife officials, or worse, someone with a legitimate claim to the eggs. No, this would have to remain his secret, at least until he figured out what he was dealing with. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges that seemed to mirror the iridescent shells of the eggs. Frank knew he needed to make a decision. The eggs' warmth suggested they required incubation, but he couldn't risk bringing them into the house where Sarah or Emma might find them. His wife was practical and level-headed. She'd insist on calling authorities. And Emma, bless her heart, couldn't keep a secret to save her life. The whole valley would know about the eggs before breakfast tomorrow. Then he remembered the old storage shed behind the house. His father's antique incubator was still there, gathering dust beneath a tarp. It was a sturdy piece of equipment built in an era when things were made to last. With some cleaning and minor repairs, it could provide the controlled environment these eggs might need. Standing up, Frank carefully transferred the eggs from the wooden crate to his jacket pockets, distributing them evenly to avoid any accidents. Their warmth seemed to spread through the fabric, as if they approved of his decision to help them. As he walked toward the storage shed, he found himself talking to them softly, the way he used to talk to newly hatched chicks. "Don't you worry," he murmured, patting his pockets gently. "Whatever you are, I'll make sure you have the best chance possible. The Dawsons have been raising birds for 3 generations. We'll figure this out together." The storage shed's door creaked open, releasing the musty smell of aged wood and stored memories. Frank paused in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Somewhere in here was the incubator that might help save his family's farm, assuming, of course, that these eggs actually contained something valuable, and not something that would make him regret this decision for the rest of his life. But as he felt the reassuring warmth of the eggs against his chest, Frank knew he'd already made his choice. Sometimes a farmer had to trust his instincts, even when they led him down uncertain paths. Whatever mysteries these black eggs held, he was now committed to seeing them through to the end. The old storage shed held decades of farming history, layers of dust covering equipment that had been passed down through generations of Dawsons. Frank worked methodically by the light of a battery-powered lantern, clearing away boxes and old feed sacks until he uncovered what he was looking for: his father's prized incubator, still protected under its heavy canvas tarp. Removing the cover released a cloud of dust that made him cough, but underneath, the incubator looked surprisingly well preserved. It was a Peterson model from the 1960s, built like a tank with solid steel construction and analog controls that never needed software updates or technical support. His father had always claimed this machine had a perfect hatch rate, something he attributed to its soul, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of successful hatchings embedded somehow in its very metal. Frank ran his hands over the machine's surface, memories flooding back of standing beside his father as a boy, watching in wonder as chicks pecked their way into the world. The incubator was larger than modern domestic models, designed for commercial farming, but small enough to be managed by one person. It would need thorough cleaning and testing, but Frank felt certain he could get it running again. "First things first," he muttered to himself, carefully removing the black eggs from his jacket pockets and placing them in a padded basket. The eggs seemed to glow faintly in the lantern light, their iridescent shells creating mysterious patterns on the shed's wooden walls. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow watching him, waiting to see if he would prove worthy of whatever secret they contained. For the next several hours, Frank worked tirelessly to restore the incubator. He cleaned every surface with disinfectant, checked and replaced old wiring, and tested the heating elements. The temperature control system needed adjustment, The old mercury thermometer had lost its accuracy. But he found a digital thermometer in his toolbox that would serve as a backup. The humidity gauge still worked perfectly, its needle moving smoothly as he tested it with a damp cloth. The biggest challenge was finding a safe power source. The shed's electrical connection had been damaged in the tornado, and running a new line might raise questions from Sarah. Finally, Frank remembered the old generator in the back of the shed. It was a quiet model they'd bought for emergencies, and it had enough fuel to run for several weeks. He positioned it carefully, using hay bales to muffle its already low sound. As sunset approached, Frank faced his next challenge: creating the right conditions for these unusual eggs. Normal chicken eggs needed specific temperature and humidity levels. But what about these? Their unnatural warmth suggested they might need higher temperatures. But by how much? Too hot or too cold could kill whatever was growing inside them. After careful consideration, Frank decided to start with standard chicken egg parameters: 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit and 55% humidity. He could adjust these levels if he noticed any signs of distress. The incubator had a viewing window that would allow him to monitor the eggs without opening the chamber, and he could make incremental changes as needed. Setting up a small desk beside the incubator, Frank began a detailed logbook. He recorded the discovery location, the egg's characteristics, and his initial incubator settings. If these eggs did contain something extraordinary, documentation might prove valuable. He also sketched each egg, noting their subtle differences in size and the unique patterns in their iridescent shells. Day 1, he wrote at the top of the first page. 12 eggs found after tornado. Shell characteristics unlike any known species. Temperature holding steady at 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit. No visible changes yet. Will monitor every 4 hours. Frank knew the schedule would be demanding. He'd need to check the eggs several times each night, adjusting temperature and humidity as needed. The generator would require regular refueling, and he'd have to maintain the secrecy of his project while continuing his regular farm duties. It would mean even less sleep than he was already getting, but he felt energized by the purpose this discovery had given him. Looking at his watch, Frank realized Sarah would be wondering where he was. He'd missed dinner, and she'd probably tried calling his cell phone several times. He needed a plausible explanation for his absence and his future time in the shed. After some thought, he decided to tell a partial truth. He was salvaging equipment from the tornado damage, trying to repair what he could to save money. It wasn't completely false, and it would explain his irregular hours. Before leaving the shed, Frank made one final check of his setup. The temperature was stable, humidity looked good, and the generator was running smoothly. He arranged some old equipment around the incubator to hide it from casual view. Not that anyone ever came out here, but he couldn't be too careful. Finally, he placed a motion sensor near the door that would alert his phone if anyone entered the shed while he was away. Standing in the doorway, Frank looked back at the soft red glow of the incubator's heating element. The black eggs sat motionless in their new nest, their mysterious shells reflecting the light like dark jewels. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Was he crazy to put so much hope in these strange eggs? Was he risking his family's precious remaining resources on what might turn out to be nothing more than a bizarre natural phenomenon? But as he closed and locked the shed door, Frank felt that same unexplainable certainty he'd experienced when he first found the eggs. Whatever they contained, these eggs had come to his farm for a reason. Now he just had to make sure he did everything possible to help them hatch. The future of the Dawson farm might depend on what emerged from those gleaming black shells. The first week of monitoring the mysterious eggs established a grueling new routine in Frank's life. Every 4 hours, day and night, he made the trek to the storage shed, checking temperature readings, adjusting humidity levels, and documenting any changes in the egg's appearance. The lack of sleep was beginning to show on his face, but the prospect of what might emerge from those black shells kept him going. During his night checks, Frank often found himself sitting in the old leather chair he'd moved into the shed, just watching the eggs through the incubator's viewing window. Their iridescent shells seemed more active in the darkness, pulsing with subtle waves of deep purple and midnight blue that couldn't be explained by the red glow of the heating element. Sometimes, when the generator's hum hit a certain pitch, the eggs appeared to vibrate in response, as if communicating in some frequency he couldn't quite understand. Sarah had noticed the changes in his behavior. At breakfast one morning, she'd touched the dark circles under his eyes with concern. "You're pushing yourself too hard with these repairs," she'd said, worry evident in her voice. "The insurance money will cover the essential equipment. You don't need to try saving everything." Frank had just smiled and assured her he was fine, the guilt of his deception sitting heavy in his stomach alongside his coffee. The farm's regular operations continued to demand attention. Every morning, Frank still had to tend to his remaining chicken flocks, now housed in the smaller backup coops after the tornado. The daily egg collections had dropped significantly due to the birds' stress from the storm, adding more pressure to their already strained finances. But Frank found himself looking at his ordinary brown and white eggs differently now, wondering if his regular chickens somehow sensed the presence of their mysterious possible cousins in the shed. By the 10th day, Frank had filled nearly half his logbook with observations. The egg's temperature had stabilized at 101.3 degrees Fahrenheit, slightly higher than normal chicken eggs, but they seemed to prefer it that way. Any attempt to lower it resulted in what Frank could only describe as agitation, increased pulsing of their iridescent shells, and a faint, almost musical humming sound that set his teeth on edge. Emma had nearly discovered his secret during the second week. She'd followed him to the shed one afternoon, curious about where her father kept disappearing to. Frank had barely managed to distract her with a project sorting old farm records, but her questions about the generator's sound had been persistent. "It's for the emergency freezer," he'd lied, hating himself for deceiving his daughter but knowing he couldn't risk anyone finding out about the eggs until they hatched. The isolation of his secret was starting to wear on him. During his long nights in the shed, Frank found himself talking to the eggs, sharing his hopes and fears. He told them about the farm's history, about his grandfather's struggles during the Great Depression, about his own children's dreams for the future. Sometimes he could have sworn the eggs pulsed brighter in response to his voice, as if they were listening and understanding. His record-keeping had become almost obsessive. Every slight change in the egg's appearance was noted and sketched. The shells had begun developing tiny, intricate patterns that reminded Frank of constellations, swirling designs that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. He'd tried photographing these patterns with his phone, but the images always came out blurry or completely black, as if the eggs refused to be documented by modern technology. The financial pressure continued to mount. Bills arrived with increasing frequency, each one marked with urgent red stamps. The bank had started leaving messages about their overdue mortgage payments. Frank had been forced to sell another portion of his flock just to keep the electricity on. Each time he signed over a batch of chickens to the buyer, he consoled himself with thoughts of the mysterious eggs and what they might bring. During the third week, Frank noticed the first significant changes. The eggs had grown slightly larger, their shells stretching to accommodate whatever was developing inside. Through the incubator's window, he could sometimes see shadows moving beneath the iridescent surface, suggesting forms that seemed too complex for ordinary chicks. The humidity in the incubator would fluctuate wildly without explanation, and the generator's fuel consumption had inexplicably increased, as if the eggs were drawing more energy than simple heating should require. Late one night, as Frank made his regular check, he discovered small crystals forming on the incubator's walls. They were clear as diamond but cold to the touch, despite the chamber's warmth. When he documented this in his logbook, the crystals had already disappeared, leaving him to question whether exhaustion was finally taking its toll on his mind. The waiting was the hardest part. Normal chicken eggs typically hatched after 21 days, but Frank had no way of knowing if these eggs followed any conventional timeline. Every morning he hoped to find signs of hatching, and every evening he had to content himself with just the subtle changes in the shell's patterns. His dreams had become filled with images of black feathered birds with impossible features, their forms always just beyond clear vision. As the fourth week approached, Frank's anticipation reached new heights. The eggs had begun emitting a low, steady hum that he could feel more than hear. Their shells now seemed almost translucent at times, revealing tantalizing glimpses of movement within. Whatever was growing inside those mysterious black eggs, Frank knew it would change everything. He just hoped he was prepared for what might emerge. Just as Frank's hopes for the mysterious eggs were reaching their peak, disaster struck the Dawson farm once again. The first signs of trouble came during his regular morning check of the incubator. As he approached the storage shed, he noticed something was wrong. The familiar hum of the generator was missing, replaced by an eerie silence that made his heart sink. Racing inside, Frank found the generator cold and lifeless. His hands trembled as he checked the fuel tank. It was still half full. Something had caused the machine to fail during the night, cutting power to the incubator for God knew how many hours. The digital thermometer display was dark, and when he placed his hand against the incubator's glass, he felt none of the usual warmth. "No, no, no," Frank muttered, frantically working to restart the generator. The starter cord pulled smoothly, but produced no response, not even a sputter. His mind raced through possible solutions: jumper cables from his truck battery, the spare generator from the main house, anything to restore power before the eggs were damaged. But as he reached for the incubator door, a wave of dizziness swept over him. The room began to spin, and Frank had to grab the workbench to steady himself. He'd been pushing himself too hard these past weeks, sleeping only in brief snatches between egg checks, neglecting his own health in favor of his mysterious charges. Now his body was finally rebelling against the abuse, and at the worst possible moment. Sweat broke out across his forehead despite the morning chill. The pounding in his head intensified, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Frank tried to focus on the incubator, on the precious eggs that needed his help, but another wave of dizziness sent him staggering. His last conscious thought was of the eggs as he collapsed onto the shed's dirt floor. Hours passed before Sarah, worried by his absence at breakfast, found him unconscious in the storage shed. The local doctor diagnosed severe exhaustion complicated by pneumonia. He'd been working in the cold, damp conditions without proper rest for too long. Despite Frank's delirious protests, they took him to the county hospital 30 miles away. For 3 days, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever-addled mind filled with images of the black eggs. In his more lucid moments, he tried to tell Sarah about them, about the generator that needed restarting, but the words came out as incomprehensible mumbles. The antibiotics and forced rest gradually began to work, but all he could think about was the dropping temperature in the incubator, the failing generator, the eggs slowly losing their mysterious warmth. On the 4th day, when his fever finally broke, Frank attempted to get out of bed. A stern nurse caught him trying to disconnect his IV and threatened to sedate him if he didn't stay put. Sarah brought Emma to visit, and their worried faces made him realize how close he'd come to serious consequences. Still, he couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety about the eggs. "The shed," he managed to croak out during Sarah's evening visit. "There's something I need to check." "Don't worry about the farm," Sarah soothed, misunderstanding his concern. "Jake from next door is helping with the chickens, and Emma's been collecting eggs after school. Everything's under control." But everything wasn't under control. Frank knew that with each passing hour, the chances of the eggs surviving dropped. Without proper temperature and humidity control, without the careful monitoring he'd been providing, what hope did they have? The mysterious life forms growing inside those black shells were probably already lost, along with his dreams of saving the farm. During his hospital stay, the family's financial situation grew even more dire. Medical bills began arriving before he was even discharged, their threatening language making it clear that insurance wouldn't cover all the costs. Sarah had been forced to miss several days of substitute teaching to be with him, further straining their resources. When Frank finally returned home a week later, still weak but determined, he headed straight for the storage shed. Sarah tried to stop him, insisting he needed more rest, but he had to know. The sight that greeted him confirmed his worst fears. The generator remained silent, the incubator dark and cold. Through the viewing window, the once gleaming black eggs sat lifeless, their iridescent shells now dull and lackluster. Grief and guilt overwhelmed him as he sank into his chair beside the incubator. All those weeks of careful monitoring, all those sleepless nights, all the hope he'd invested in these mysterious eggs, wasted. He'd failed them, just as he was failing his family and the generations of Dawsons who'd built this farm. But as Frank sat there in the growing darkness, too exhausted and heartbroken to move, something caught his eye. One of the eggs, the largest of the clutch, still held a faint glimmer of its original sheen. And as he watched, hardly daring to breathe, he could have sworn he saw it pulse, ever so slightly, with that familiar otherworldly light. The discovery of that single pulsing egg changed everything. Despite his weakened condition, Frank felt a surge of renewed purpose. He couldn't manage this alone anymore. He needed help, but choosing whom to trust would be crucial. After careful consideration, he decided to confide in Jake Miller, his closest neighbor and friend of 30 years. Jake arrived within minutes of Frank's call, concern etched on his weathered face. As Frank led him into the storage shed, he could feel his friend's skepticism turning to amazement at the sight of the black eggs. The larger egg's faint pulsing was clearly visible in the dim light, its subtle rhythm hypnotic. "Good Lord above," Jake whispered, leaning in for a closer look. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years of farming. Where did you say you found them?" Frank explained everything. The discovery after the tornado, his weeks of secret monitoring, the generator failure during his illness. Jake listened without interruption, his expression shifting from disbelief to fascination. When Frank finished, Jake straightened up and rolled up his sleeves. "Well, sitting here won't save that egg. Let's get to work," he said decisively. "I've got a newer generator in my truck. We'll have power back in 10 minutes. And my wife Martha still has that fancy egg incubator from when she was breeding show chickens. It's digital, but it'll serve as a backup." Over the next few hours, the two men worked steadily to restore the incubation system. Jake's generator proved more efficient than Frank's old one, and they rigged up a redundant power supply to prevent another failure. Martha's incubator, while smaller, would provide emergency backup if needed. As they worked, Jake shared his own struggles with modern farming. His corn operation had been hit hard by the same economic pressures threatening Frank's egg business. "Sometimes I think the days of family farms are numbered," he admitted, connecting the new power cables. "But then I remember what my daddy used to say, the land provides for those who listen to it. Maybe these eggs are the land's way of providing for you, Frank." The next challenge was maintaining constant monitoring while Frank recovered. Jake organized a small group of trusted neighbors, people who had known the Dawsons for generations and understood the importance of discretion. Each took shifts checking the generator and recording the egg's condition using a detailed protocol Frank had developed. Martha Miller, Jake's wife, proved particularly valuable. Her experience with show chickens gave her an eye for subtle changes in egg development. She was the first to notice that the surviving eggs' patterns seemed to shift in response to certain types of music. After that discovery, they kept a small radio in the shed, playing classical music that appeared to strengthen the eggs' pulsing. Old Tom Peterson, their former feed mill operator, volunteered to handle the night shift. "Can't sleep much these days anyway," he said gruffly, though Frank could see the excitement in his eyes whenever he looked at the mysterious egg. Tom's mechanical skills also proved invaluable in fine-tuning the incubator's systems. The community's involvement transformed the atmosphere in the storage shed. What had been a place of solitary vigilance became a hub of quiet activity and shared purpose. They installed comfortable chairs, a small coffee maker, and a logbook where each observer could record their observations. The neighbors took pride in their secret project, sharing Frank's hope that something extraordinary might emerge. Sarah noticed the change in her husband as well. Though still recovering, Frank seemed more at peace knowing he wasn't bearing the burden alone. She didn't ask questions about the increased activity in the storage shed, understanding that some mysteries needed to unfold in their own time. Emma, too, sensed something was happening. She started bringing sandwiches to the repair crew in the shed, though they never let her stay long enough to see what they were really monitoring. Her presence reminded them all of what they were fighting for. the future of family farming in Whispering Pines Valley. As days passed, the surviving egg showed increasing signs of vitality. Its pulsing grew stronger, and the iridescent patterns on its shell became more pronounced. The other eggs remained lifeless, but no one suggested removing them. They had become a sort of memorial, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. The shared secret created new bonds among the neighbors. They spoke in hushed tones about their hopes for what might hatch, sharing stories of strange sightings in the valley over the years. Old Tom recalled his grandfather's tales of mysterious lights in the mountain passes, while Martha remembered unusual tracks found in her garden years ago. One evening, as Frank sat with Jake during their shared observation shift, his friend turned to him with a serious expression. "Whatever comes out of that egg," Jake said quietly, "this valley will stand behind you. We've lost too many family farms already. Sometimes it takes something extraordinary to remind us what's worth preserving." Frank looked at the pulsing egg, its gleaming surface now reflecting the faces of all those who had come together to help save it. Whatever mystery these eggs held, they had already worked one kind of magic, reminding him that no farmer truly stood alone, even in the hardest times. On a crisp morning exactly 37 days after the egg's initial discovery, Frank was jolted awake by an urgent call from Old Tom, who had the pre-dawn observation shift. The old feed mill operator's voice trembled with excitement. "Frank, you need to get down here right now. Something's happening." By the time Frank arrived at the storage shed, still pulling on his jacket, Jake and Martha had already joined Tom. They stood in a semicircle around the incubator, their faces illuminated by an otherworldly glow. The surviving egg was pulsing with an intensity Frank had never seen before, its shell emanating waves of deep blue and purple light that filled the entire shed. "It started about 20 minutes ago," Tom explained, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by wide-eyed wonder. "First, there was this sound, like crystal glasses singing. Then the light show began. The egg's surface had become almost transparent, revealing shadowy movements within. The patterns that had decorated its shell were now shifting and flowing like liquid metal, creating mesmerizing designs that seemed to tell some ancient story none of them could quite understand. Martha, with her years of experience breeding show chickens, shook her head in amazement. "This is like no hatching I've ever seen," she whispered. "Normal eggs pip first. Make a small hole. This is something entirely different." As they watched, the egg's glow intensified. The temperature in the incubator began to rise despite the controls being untouched. Digital displays flickered erratically, and the generator's hum took on a different pitch, as if responding to some unseen force. "Should we do something?" Jake asked, reaching for the incubator door. But Frank held him back. "No," he said firmly. "Whatever's happening, we need to let it proceed naturally. We've come too far to interfere now." The next hour was filled with tension and wonder as the egg continued its transformation. The shell's surface began to ripple like water, its material seeming to defy the normal laws of nature. The other 11 eggs, long since gone dark, suddenly began to resonate with a faint echo of their surviving siblings' glow. Sarah arrived just before sunrise, having noticed the unusual lights from the farmhouse. Frank briefly worried she'd be angry about the secret he'd kept, but one look at the miraculous scene before them swept away all such concerns. She quietly took her place beside him, slipping her hand into his as they waited. The first crack appeared just as the sun's early rays reached the shed's windows, but unlike a normal egg's fracture, this one appeared as a line of light, splitting the shell like a seam of pure energy. The assembled group held their breath as more lines appeared, creating a complex geometric pattern across the egg's surface. Then came the sound, a high, clear note that made everyone's ears pop. The egg's shell began to separate along those lines of light, not breaking, but rather unfolding like a flower, blooming in fast motion. The light grew so intense that they had to shield their eyes. When the glow finally dimmed enough for them to look again, Frank felt his knees go weak. There, amid the transformed shell fragments, sat a creature that defied explanation. It was clearly avian in basic form, but unlike any bird he'd ever seen or imagined. The being was about the size of a large chicken, but its feathers were unlike anything on Earth. Each one seemed to contain an entire universe of stars, shifting and gleaming with deep blacks, blues, and purples. Its eyes were like opals, featuring every color imaginable, yet somehow remaining primarily silver. A small crest of crystalline formations rose from its head, catching the morning light and breaking it into rainbow patterns across the shed walls. But most remarkably, the creature seemed to be composed partly of pure energy. Areas of its body appeared solid, while others shifted between material and light, creating an effect that made it difficult to focus on directly. As it moved, it left trailing afterimages in the air, like echoes of starlight. The creature turned its gaze on each person in the room, and Frank could have sworn he felt a gentle touch in his mind with each glance. When it looked at him, he experienced a flood of emotions and images: gratitude for his care, understanding of his struggles, and something else, a promise of change to come. Tom was the first to find his voice. "Good Lord," he whispered, removing his cap. "It's beautiful." Martha had tears streaming down her face. "In all my years." She started, but couldn't finish. The creature lifted its head and emitted a sound that was both song and light, a harmonious combination that seemed to resonate with something deep in their souls. The remaining 11 eggs, which they had thought dead, began to respond, their shells starting to regain their original luster. Jake grabbed Frank's shoulder. "Look," he exclaimed, pointing at the other eggs. "They weren't dead. They were waiting." Frank couldn't speak. His vision blurred with tears as he watched the miracle before him. All those weeks of hope and fear, the exhaustion, the illness, the despair of thinking he'd failed. It had all led to this moment. Whatever these creatures were, they were going to change everything. Sarah squeezed his hand. "You knew," she said softly. "Somehow you knew these were special." The creature spread its wings, revealing a span that seemed impossibly large for the incubator that had contained it. Each feather rippled with cosmic light, and small motes of energy danced in the air around it. As the sun rose fully outside, its light struck the crystalline crest, creating a display that transformed the humble storage shed into something that felt like a cathedral. And in that moment, Frank Dawson, third-generation chicken farmer from Whispering Pines Valley, realized that his life's greatest challenge had become his family's salvation. The impossible had hatched in his storage shed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Friends, before we continue with this incredible story, I want to take a moment to express my gratitude for your amazing support. If you're as captivated by Frank's discovery as I am, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps us bring more extraordinary stories like this to light. Now let's return to that remarkable morning in the storage shed, where the mysterious creature had just emerged from its black egg. The silence that filled the storage shed was unlike anything Frank had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if time itself had paused to acknowledge the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The cosmic bird, still emanating waves of ethereal light, had captivated everyone present with its otherworldly beauty. Martha Miller had automatically reached for her phone to document the moment, but the creature's energy seemed to interfere with any attempt at photography. Each image came out either completely blank or showed only a brilliant blur of light where the bird should have been. It was as if the being existed partially in a dimension that couldn't be captured by ordinary technology. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be photographed," old Tom mused, watching Martha's frustrated attempts. "Some memories are just for those who were there to witness them." The elderly farmer's words carried a profound truth. In an age where every moment was usually documented and shared instantly, they found themselves in a situation that demanded to be experienced purely in the present. The absence of photographic evidence would later add to the mystery and wonder of their story. Sarah, still holding Frank's hand, watched as the creature began to examine its surroundings with evident intelligence. Its movements were graceful, yet somehow impossible to track fully with the human eye, as if it was moving through multiple points in space simultaneously. The air around it shimmered with tiny particles of light, like stardust falling in reverse. "Look at the other eggs," Jake whispered, drawing everyone's attention back to the incubator. The remaining 11 eggs had begun to pulse in harmony with the first creature's movements. Their shells, which had appeared lifeless just hours ago, now rippled with renewed energy. The patterns on their surfaces had begun to shift and flow like liquid metal, mirroring the designs they had seen on the first egg before it hatched. Frank felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. One such creature had already defied everything he thought he knew about the natural world. What would happen when all 12 had hatched? Would his farm, his whole life, be ready for such a dramatic transformation? The cosmic bird turned its opalescent eyes toward him, and Frank felt that gentle mental touch again. This time, he received a clearer impression. These beings hadn't arrived on his farm by accident. They had chosen this place, this moment, this family. The revelation left him breathless. Emma's voice suddenly carried from outside the shed. "Dad? Mom? Are you in there? The chickens need feeding, and there's this weird light coming from the windows." The adults exchanged panicked looks. They hadn't planned for this moment. How does one explain a creature that seems to have emerged from the stars themselves? Before they could respond, however, the cosmic bird made a soft, trilling sound that seemed to carry an obvious meaning. It was time to share the secret. "Come in, sweetheart," Sarah called out, moving to open the door. "There's something your father and I need to show you." The door creaked open, letting in a shaft of morning sunlight that created a spectacular prism effect as it passed through the creature's crystalline crest. Emma stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the assembled group of neighbors, the glowing incubator, and, finally, the impossible being that stood watching her with evident curiosity. "Oh," she breathed, one hand reaching out instinctively before dropping back to her side. "Oh, wow." The cosmic bird tilted its head, regarding Emma with the same gentle intelligence it had shown the adults. Then, to everyone's amazement, it began to sing. The sound was unlike any earthly music. It was pure light transformed into melody, each note carrying colors and emotions that seemed to bypass their ears entirely and speak directly to their souls. Emma's face lit up with pure joy, and Frank realized that children might be better equipped to accept such wonders than adults. Where the grown-ups had struggled to reconcile the creature's existence with their understanding of reality, Emma simply accepted it as it was, a magical being that had chosen their farm as its home. As the crystal-clear notes of the cosmic bird song filled the shed, Frank felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The financial struggles, the exhaustion, the fear of losing everything, all of it had led to this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not just as a family, but as guardians of something truly extraordinary. The cosmic bird's song reached a crescendo, and the remaining eggs began to pulse more intensely in response. The next chapter of their adventure was about to begin, and Frank knew that nothing in Whispering Pines Valley would ever be quite the same again. Over the next 7 days, the remaining 11 eggs hatched in succession, each emergence more spectacular than the last. The storage shed had become a gateway between worlds, filled with beings that seemed to embody the very essence of cosmic wonder. Each bird was unique, their feathers containing different patterns of stars and nebulae, their crystalline crests forming distinct configurations that cast ever-changing light patterns across the walls. Dr. Helena Wright, a renowned ornithologist who had heard whispers of something extraordinary in Whispering Pines Valley, arrived at the farm on the morning the final egg hatched. Her scientific skepticism lasted exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds, the time it took for one of the cosmic birds to make direct eye contact with her. She sat down hard on an old feed sack, her carefully prepared scientific notebooks forgotten. "This changes everything," she whispered, watching the creatures interact with each other in their impossible dance of light and energy. "Do you understand what you have here, Mr. Dawson?" Frank nodded slowly. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. These beings had chosen his farm, his family, for a reason. Their presence had already begun to transform the property in subtle ways. The grass around the storage shed grew in impossible shades of green, and flowers that had never been seen in Montana were blooming out of season. More remarkably, the farm's ordinary chickens had begun laying eggs with shells that showed faint traces of iridescence. Nothing like the cosmic bird's eggs, but distinctive enough to catch the attention of specialty markets. Orders started pouring in from high-end restaurants and collectors, willing to pay premium prices for these subtly enhanced eggs. Word spread carefully, through trusted channels. The Dawson farm became a closely guarded secret in the scientific community. Instead of massive media attention that would have disrupted their lives, a steady stream of carefully vetted researchers and spiritual leaders made pilgrimages to the farm, each leaving profoundly changed by their encounters with the cosmic birds. The beings themselves seemed content to stay, transforming the old storage shed into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Visitors reported seeing different things when they looked inside. Some saw a vast starlit space, others a crystal cathedral that sang with impossible harmonies. To Emma, who spent every free moment with the creatures, it was simply the star room. Financial salvation came in unexpected ways. The cosmic bird's presence enhanced everything they touched. The farm's soil became extraordinarily fertile, producing crops of unprecedented quality. The water in the wells tested pure enough to be bottled as premium spring water. Even the air around the property carried a subtle energy that left people feeling refreshed and renewed. 1 year after the first egg hatched, Frank stood in the doorway of the transformed shed, watching the cosmic birds in their daily flight pattern. Their aerial dance created curtains of light in the sky that could be seen for miles, though most observers attributed it to unusual aurora activity. Sarah slipped her arm around his waist, and Emma leaned against his other side. "Did you ever imagine?" Sarah asked softly, watching as the beings created patterns of starlight above their farm. "When you first found those black eggs?" Frank shook his head. "Never in my wildest dreams. But I knew they were special. Somehow I just knew. The cosmic birds had chosen them as guardians, and in return, they had saved not just the Dawson farm, but something far more precious: the belief in wonder itself." Each night, as Frank made his final check on the beings that had transformed his life, he offered a quiet prayer of gratitude for that moment of courage when he'd decided to trust his instincts about those mysterious black eggs. The Dawson farm had become more than just a place. It was now a bridge between Earth and something far more vast and beautiful. And as Frank watched his daughter sharing songs with beings made of starlight, he knew that his family's legacy would stretch far beyond the confines of their valley, touching the lives of generations to come in ways he could never have imagined. As twilight settled over Whispering Pines Valley, the cosmic birds gathered for their evening symphony, their combined songs creating a harmony that made the very air shimmer with possibility. The remaining eggshells, still preserved in the original incubator, continued to glow faintly, a reminder of the day when impossible dreams had hatched into reality. And so, the story of the black eggs became a legend, whispered around farmhouse tables and passed down through generations. But unlike most legends, this one had living proof, in a transformed storage shed on a family farm in Montana, where beings of starlight and crystal danced between dimensions, and where one farmer's courage to believe in miracles had changed everything. Call to action. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing tales of wonder and transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what you would do if you discovered something truly extraordinary on your property. Until our next story, remember that sometimes the most magical things in life come disguised as simple black eggs.